This week's parsha is Parsha of Tazria. I heard this for our Torah 3 years ago from Rav Bernstein. And this week's parsha and next week's parsha both talk about the malady of tzaraat. Tzaraat is often translated as leprosy. And just as a clarification, when the Torah itself talks about tzaraat, it's actually talking about a spiritual disease. It's true that it has physical symptoms, but ultimately the cause is spiritual. Now, the way tzaraat settles in, stage 1 is that it goes into the house, right, into the walls of the house. And then afterwards, if the person doesn't do tshuva, it doesn't fix himself, then it settles into his clothing, and then finally it settles into his skin. So it's a 3-step process. And the reason why this is interesting is because, says Rav Bernstein, the way the parsha itself, or the 2 parshas talk about it, is in the exact opposite order. If we're to look fairly early on in the parsha, we'll see that first it talks about how it settles into the person's skin. And then only after that, it talks about the garments, right, the clothing. And then actually in next week's parsha, it talks about the house. Now, what's interesting is it seems to be flipping the order, and the answer is why, or the question is why. Why does the Torah itself reverse the order of tzaraat? What's going on here? So there are a number of answers to this, but we'll settle in on 2. So the first we'll give is that of Rabbeinu Bechaya. He was a Sfardi Gadol, he was a Rishon. He's probably most famous for his work on the Torah, on his Pirush on the Torah, on Chumash, and we'll see what he has to say. So he quotes a pasuk in Mishlei that says, "Darchei darchei noam," right? Its ways are the ways of pleasantness. That is to say, the Torah's ways are the ways of pleasantness. Now, how does this relate? This isn't only a nice hashkafa. It's like, the words of the Torah, they're so pleasant. If a person does what the Torah does, then that's such a nice way of living. It's more than that. It's actually even a halachic concept, and we see this in the Gemara in Sukkah, right? In the Talmud, the tractate of Sukkah that talks about how to build a Sukkah, and of course it talks about not only how to build a Sukkah, but also other halachas relating to Sukkah, in particular the Arba Minim, right? The 4 species that we take, the etrog and the hadassim and the lulav and the aravos, and it actually derives what plant is meant to be used as the hadassim, because when the Torah itself talks about the Arba Minim, it does not actually call them by the names we're familiar with. If we're to look in Parshat Emor, that's in Vayikra chapter 23 verse 40, it says, pre-Eitz Hadar, right? You shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of a citron tree. Now that turns out to be the etrog. That's not what the Torah says. And then kapot tmarim, which is the branches of date palms, va'anaf eitzavot, the twigs of a plaited tree, v'arvei nachal, right, and brook willows. Now the question is, va'anaf eitzavot, the twigs of a plaited tree. What is that? Now we know it's hadassim, but how do we know that? That's not what the Torah actually says. It just says twigs of a plaited tree. So ultimately the Gemara narrows it down to 2 options. It's either the hadas, no surprise there, or it's the hardof. Now, what is that? But the Gemara says, no, it can't be, because this is also twigs of a plaited tree, but the Gemara concludes it can't be the hardof. Why is that? Darchei noam, because the ways of the Torah are ways of pleasantness. Now, the reason why that's relevant is because the hardof had spikes on it, right? It had thorns in a way, which meant it was very unpleasant to carry. And as a result, there's no way the Torah would have commanded the Jewish people to hold on to leaves that had spikes in them. Darchei noam. Its ways are the ways of pleasantness, and therefore it must be the hadassim. Fine. So the way this settles in now with our parsha is because the Torah begins with talking about the worst affliction, that is to say, the affliction on a person's skin, because to say it the other way around is actually much less pleasant. That is to say, the Torah immediately tells you how bad it can get. Now you know, and then of course later on it just gets not as bad, so you can kind of breathe a sigh of relief. You're like, well, that's as bad as it's going to get. Now I can kind of relax. On the other hand, if it started with the house, right, the house, well, that's pretty bad. Then it goes onto your clothes, and you're like, well, that's really bad. And then finally you get onto the person's skin, and you're like, that's awful. Now, that's really not a pleasant way of communicating. And therefore the Torah changes the order. That is the Fi Rabbeinu Bechaya. But there's another way of explaining it, and that's found in the Sefer Aruch LaNer, or at least the work Aruch LaNer. That's Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. He is one of the Rebbeim, one of the teachers of Rav Hirsch, right, the famous Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch of Germany. So Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinker is one of his Rebbeim. Now, what he says, actually, is an idea that we've heard before. That is to say, the Negaim are in reverse order because when you wish to deter someone, you'll show just how bad things can get. And the whole goal of this is that you want to tell them, do not do this. Do not come to this point. And the best way to do this is to slam them with the worst punishment they could get. And in that way, the Torah is effectively trying to say that it's not trying to show you like, oh, this is the way that you can deal with tzaraat once it happens. The Torah is trying to prevent it. And the best way to prevent it is by showing you just how bad it can get. And in that way, the person will step back and be like, wow, this sounds awful. I'm not going to get to this place to begin with. That's why it starts with the worst. That's why it goes in a reverse order, shows you just how bad it can get, and then it slowly eases up in order to kind of give us that message. And what's beautiful about this is we've actually seen this at least a couple of times in Chumash. Once we see this when Moshe first goes to talk to Paro. Amazingly, this is something that often we just kind of skip over, we don't even notice it. But Moshe initially tells Paro, he tells him about the Amakat Bechorot. Tells him like your firstborn can die, just to give Paro a sense of like it can get this bad, so that hopefully you will do tshuva, you'll release the Jewish people. We won't have to get there, and therefore all this unpleasantness will be avoided. That's why Moshe opened with Makat Bechorot, and we saw this last year in Parshat Mishpatim. We see an eye for an eye, and so many other things. The halacha is that if someone steals from you and you can't repay the loan, then you take him as a slave. What does that mean? You're going to bring him into your house, near your family, after he stole from you? And the answer is yes. Because the idea of Mishpatim is, what is the best use for your property? We're trying to find a way not only to punish wrongdoers, but ultimately to bring them back into the fold. And that is the goal of Mishpatim, right? That is the whole point of having Jewish laws in order to help other people. This is a theme we see regularly throughout the Torah. Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next week.